Hello, Florence, my love. Are you ready for chapter 31? I am. They're gone. Flora jumped. Sophia had come up behind her silently. Flora turned back to look at the tracks. I figured you were with them. I wasn't invited. Sophia stepped forward and cleaned an ear with a paw. She sneezed and shook her head. Oh well, why would a cat want to go on a journey where she would end up dead, and all for the sake of others? She paused. Still, I can't help but be worried about Oscar. He acts like he's better, but I still think he's sick. He is still sick, and I'm going after them. Flora's own words surprised her. She hadn't known she was going to say them, but she knew they were exactly right. No, you're not. You'll never make it out there. You weren't made for South Pole adventures. Flora gave her an icy look. I think I know by now what I was made for. If you stay here, we will have a good chance of getting rescued, said Sophia. Getting rescued is good, said Flora. If you're a cat... She stepped in between the sled tracks. Like you said, no one can resist a cat. But pigs don't get rescued. They get fattened up for later. Sophia followed, rubbing her sides on Flora's hind leg. Aren't you afraid of dying out there? Nope, said Flora. I'm afraid of being afraid for the rest of my life. Well, best of luck and happy rescues. She took a few steps. You'll regret this decision. Sophia jumped in front of Flora. Flora stepped behind her friend. Maybe, but I think the captain is right. Oscar and Alaric aren't in good enough shape to make it on their own. I believe I can pull a sled as well as any dog. Speaking of the captain, what about him? He needs you. He needs the food that will be coming on that sled even more. Sophia looked back at the camp, but when Flora trotted off again, the cat dropped in behind her and stayed at her heels. Finally, Flora spun around in a cloud of powder. What are you doing? Sophia shook the snow off of her ears. You're not the only one who can be stubborn. Flora felt a shiver in her knees, and it wasn't from cold. It was a shiver of hope that she'd have a teammate and not be alone in the emptiness. That was selfish, though. Out there was no place for a cat. You're hardly bigger than a snowball. You'd just be a burden. At least I don't sink in the snow up to my knees with each step, said Sophia. Go home, Snowball. I'm not going to stay at camp and be alone. It doesn't work for me anymore. Then you're a fool. I used to be a fool, said Sophia. A stubborn fool. I didn't know enough to stand by my friends. Now I'm just stubborn. Look, we've got a long way to go. If the pigs among us can manage to stop being so hard-headed and independent, it will be a lot easier on the cats. I can't believe a cat is lecturing a pig on being too independent. Flora started out again with Sophia right behind. Despite what Sophia said about her hooves, Flora didn't break through the icy crust. She clipped along easily. Beside the swishing of her coat and the tapping of her hooves, there was nothing else to hear. Sophia followed on such silent feet that Flora had to turn her head to see if she wasn't alone. That was when she noticed the camp had disappeared from sight behind them. I hope you know how to take care of yourself, Sheriff, she said from the front, because I don't know how to take care of either one of us. The two animals kept up their easy trot at first, but by late afternoon the sled tracks led into an icy field that looked as if someone had chopped into it with a giant axe. Great big chunks of ice were standing on end. The sled tracks weaved in and out and over the frozen boulders. Flora stopped, and Sophia came up alongside. The wind had picked up, blowing ice pellets sideways in little white waves. I wonder if we should press on or stop here for the night. Flora pretended to think about these words, but she was watching Sophia out of the corner of her eye. She hoped Sophia, with her practical nature, might have an idea, but Sophia was watching Flora. Finally, Flora couldn't help herself. Did Oscar teach you any tricks about staying alive out here? If he did, I wasn't paying attention. I think I missed that lesson myself. Sophia looked back at the way they had come. It was starting to get too dark to travel. Flora walked forward a few steps and found herself out of the wind behind a large ice boulder. She began to hollow out a spot to spend the night. Her hooves were not as good as Oscar's paws at digging snow, but she managed to make a rather shallow nest. Sophia made her own nearby, but ended up between Flora's front feet. It was a cold sleep that night, interrupted often by the howling wind. No dreams came. Flora breathed in Sophia's smell and wondered how Oscar was doing pulling the sled. "Hang on," she wished she could tell him. "We're coming." On to chapter 32. "We've lost our trail," Sophia called out the next morning. "Last night's wind must have blown it away, but we can still turn back." She had climbed a tall ice pillar and was looking at the tracks leading back to camp, which were deeper and somewhat visible. Flora tried not to show the panic in her heart as she stretched and sniffed around for a clue. Surely they weren't defeated after just one day. "Turn back, then. I want to find that crazy sick dog and the boy who won't listen to his captain." "If I turn around, you'd better stick with me, pig. You couldn't find an iceberg if you were standing on it." "I could if I had a friend who told me to look down." She looked up at Sophia and noticed something. The block of ice Sophia was standing on had been scraped. There was a line at about the height of Flora's head, as well as another mark at the same height a little farther away. "Tracks!" she called up. "You're looking in the wrong place. Tracks are on the ground." "Alaric's not the most experienced driver. I think the sides of his sled must have bumped into the chunks of ice here and there. If you can spot any more scrapes." Sophia gazed in the direction Flora was looking and then hopped down. "You're right for once. From up there, I can tell which direction they are heading." Flora grinned. "Then let's keep moving, Cap. I found the iceberg. Now you find our friends." Sophia stepped into the lead, occasionally leaping to the top of an ice mound to check the course. 2 hours later, they found the spot where Oscar and Alaric had spent the night. Alaric had made a small fire, and a few bits of charcoal could be seen in the snow. They were almost through the field of giant broken ice by now. Sophia climbed to the top of one last pillar. "Flat country ahead," she shouted, "and clear tracks. Pick up the pace, slowpoke." Flora was so happy to hear the good news she didn't bother to respond to the insult. She started clipping along a little faster, and soon she could see the flat plain herself. Apparently, the wind and sleet hadn't blown through there during the night. However, they were up on a ridge, and to get to the plain below, she and Sophia would have to find a way down the long slope of sheer ice. There was no snow on it at all. Anything on the ice simply slid to the bottom. Flora could see the scrapes where Alaric must have tried to drag his boots to slow the sled down. The scrapes led to a hole and a lot of churned up snow at the bottom, where the sled had probably crashed and then had to be pulled out. Sophia walked on a few steps down the slope and was able to keep her footing. "Come on," she called. Flora stepped out as gingerly as possible, but in an instant her feet splayed in 4 directions and she was on her belly, sliding helplessly. No amounts of scrabbling could stop her. She plowed into her traveling companion, knocking Sophia's feet out from under her. Oh no! That does not look like fun there. Sophia yelped and tried to stop herself with her claws, but Flora's weight carried the two of them down like polished stones. They struck the soft snow at the bottom with a plop, close to where Alaric's sled had landed. Snow went up Flora's nose and she sneezed. "Get off me!" yowled Sophia, and struck out with her claws to make the point. Flora squealed and struggled to find her feet in the soft drift. A few minutes later, they both stood panting, finally on a firm surface again. "Nice job, pig," said Sophia between breaths. Someone explain to me how hooves make sense at any time on any animal. I didn't hear you complaining when those hooves were kicking ship rats in the head so you could waltz up and bite them. Flora hadn't meant to even mention this matter, but now that her words were out, she was surprised at her strong feelings. Good point, Sophia said at last. I'm not very good at saying sorry, but I apologize. Flora didn't know how to respond, so she was happy when Sophia simply walked back onto the tracks. The snow on this plain was different from any other snow Flora had seen before. In fact, it wasn't really snow. Flora stepped out and the ground crackled. She bent her head and looked closer. The field was covered with ice crystals sticking up like a garden of little diamonds. Sophia was beside her now, and the two animals walked slowly into the crystal blossoms. Flora was enchanted. For a moment, she forgot she was hungry, tired, and ill-equipped to make the journey. She forgot to worry about Oscar. She forgot to worry that there would never be a useful job for her. She kicked up her front hooves with each step and watched the ice crystals scatter in front of her. But Sophia fell behind, picking her way along the trail tenderly. When Flora looked back to see what was the matter, she saw a spot of red inside each of her friend's small footprints. Sophia, said Flora, you're bleeding. Sophia stopped. Thanks for the info, Doc. She licked her front paws, took another step and winced, but kept moving. It's like walking on needles. Sophia, I think we just discovered one good use for hooves. Climb on my back. Impossible. Sophia swished her tail. Does Sophia look like a circus monkey to you? Cats don't ride pigs. They don't ride anything if they have any dignity. I'm saving my last shred. Who's going to laugh at you out here in the middle of nowhere? I don't care. Sophia is no monkey, and you're no pony, thank you. Flora planted herself in front of Sophia. I know cats like to be independent and everything, she said, but you're going to hurt your paws, and then I'll really have to take care of you. The tip of Sophia's tail twitched back and forth. I suppose, but if you say a word of this to anyone, I won't, I promise. Sophia leaped easily onto Flora's broad back. Flora looked out at the two smooth lines of sled tracks. They seemed to go on forever, but the sun was shining and the trail ahead was clear. Her spirits lifted. She took her first few steps. Hey, watch the claws, Sheriff, Flora said. You're digging them right through the coat and into my skin. Well, then don't walk so bumpy, snapped Sophia. Flora slowed down and tried to smooth out her walk. I wonder how Oscar was able to keep going through this stuff. Dog booties. Alaric was sewing some out of the leather the night before they left. I think he got the idea from the sailors. All the other dogs had them. The tracks in front of them led out in a straight line that went on for hours. Finally, the ice crystals gave way to snow that became deeper and more powdery. Sophia hopped down and walked lightly across the surface. The churned up snow between the sled tracks showed that Alaric and Oscar had to work hard to keep moving through the powder. Flora also found the going tough, even after land flattened out. Her hoofs sank down until her jacket was dragging in the snow. She could no longer walk. Instead, she had to leap forward, charging through it. Every third leap, she had to stop and catch her breath. Sophia studied her. I don't think this is working. Just go ahead, Flora panted. You can go faster than me. When you catch up with them, let them know I'm coming. Sophia paused for a moment and then, without a word, pranced away. Flora watched until she disappeared, then tried to struggle on, but there was no more leap in her. All she could do was flounder in the right direction. She got more and more exhausted, and each time she stopped, she imagined Sophia getting further and farther ahead. She began to talk to herself to find strength. Never out of options. With each stroke of her legs, Flora repeated the words Luna had taught her so long ago. Then she added a phrase. Cats may have 9 lives, but pigs don't give up. She worked like this until the light began to fade, and finally Flora had to get some rest. A cave was easy to make here. All she had to do was flop down and wriggle her body about. As she rested her head, she felt the soft feathers of fresh snowflakes land on her snout. Flora thought for a moment that the snowfall might be bad news, but she was too tired to be concerned. That is the end of chapter 32. We'll pick up with 33 next time. Time for kisses. 1 for you. 3 for your family. I love you. Goodbye.